For the world, Al Capone was a symbol of power, fear, and untouchable authority. Newspapers called him Scarface, enemies whispered his name with terror, and Chicago itself seemed to bend under his shadow. He lived in luxury, surrounded by loyal men, fast cars, expensive suits, and endless money. But behind this carefully built image of a fearless crime king, there were dark secrets Al Capone spent his entire life trying to bury, secrets that could have destroyed him long before prison ever did. Al Capone understood one simple truth better than anyone else: fear was stronger than bullets. He made sure people saw him as confident, calm, and always in control. Publicly, he donated money to charities, opened soup kitchens during hard times, and smiled for photographers as if he were a respectable businessman. But privately, his world was built on paranoia. He trusted almost no one. Even his closest allies were tested constantly, watched closely, and sometimes eliminated without warning. Betrayal haunted him more than the police ever did. One of Capone's darkest secrets was how deeply afraid he was of losing control. While others believed he ruled Chicago effortlessly, the reality was very different. Every night, he changed sleeping locations. Every meal was tested, every conversation was measured. Capone feared poison, feared betrayal, and feared weakness above all else. The man who ordered brutal executions was secretly terrified that one small mistake would expose him. Another secret Capone tried desperately to hide was his declining mental and physical health. Long before the world noticed anything wrong, his body was already betraying him. The illness he carried silently began to affect his thinking, his memory, and his judgment. His temper grew unpredictable. His decisions became reckless. Men around him noticed sudden mood swings, moments of confusion followed by bursts of violent anger. But no one dared speak of it. In Capone's world, weakness was a death sentence. There were also secrets tied to the blood on his hands, murders that were never officially connected to him, crimes erased through fear and bribery. Capone kept mental lists of who knew too much, who talked too freely, and who needed to disappear. Some of his most trusted men vanished without explanation, leaving behind nothing but silence and rumors. These were not acts of power, they were acts of desperation. Perhaps the darkest truth of all was that Al Capone knew his empire was fragile. Behind closed doors, he spoke of enemies closing in, of time running out, of a future he could no longer control. The man who once believed himself untouchable slowly realized that money could not buy peace, and violence could not stop decay, from the outside or within. The world saw Scarface the legend. But hidden beneath the tailored suits and fearless reputation was a man trapped by his own secrets, slowly collapsing under the weight of a life built on fear, lies, and silence. What Al Capone tried to hide forever was not just crime, but the truth that power could not save him from himself. As Al Capone's power reached its peak, something inside him began to crack. From the outside, his empire looked unstoppable. Speakeasies multiplied, money flowed endlessly, and his name commanded instant obedience. But behind closed doors, Capone was no longer the confident ruler people imagined. His nights grew longer, filled with restless pacing and whispered fears that refused to leave him alone. Capone started isolating himself, even from men who had once stood beside him through blood and fire. Meetings became shorter, conversations turned cold, he listened more than he spoke, his eyes scanning faces for signs of betrayal. Trust, once his greatest weapon, became his greatest weakness. Every knock on the door sounded like danger. Every unfamiliar face felt like a threat closing in. His illness continued to worsen, quietly but relentlessly. Simple thoughts became difficult. Names slipped from his memory. Rage would rise suddenly, without reason, followed by moments of exhaustion and confusion. Those closest to him noticed that the sharp mind that built an empire was slowly slipping away. Yet fear kept them silent. No one dared question the boss, even as his decisions grew unstable. Violence became Capone's shield. The more uncertain he felt, the more brutal his orders became. He believed fear could still protect him, that blood could silence the growing cracks in his authority. But each act of violence only deepened his isolation. Loyalty faded, replaced by obedience rooted in terror. Men followed him not out of respect, but out of fear of becoming the next example. Behind his guarded expressions, Capone was haunted by the past. Faces of those he had betrayed, ordered killed, or abandoned returned to him in quiet moments. Sleep brought no rest, only memories and shadows that whispered his failures. The man who once controlled an entire city could no longer control his own thoughts. Capone also understood something he refused to admit aloud: The law was closing in, and his protection was thinning. Bribes no longer worked the way they once had. Old connections disappeared. Allies turned cautious. He sensed that the walls around him were slowly tightening, and for the first time, escape felt impossible. What the world could not see was a man slowly unraveling, trapped between the empire he built and the collapse he could no longer stop. Al Capone's greatest enemy was no longer the police or rival gangs, it was the truth he carried within himself, growing louder with each passing day. Al Capone's enemies outside may have feared him, but it was the enemies within, his own mind and body, that ultimately threatened his existence. Every day brought a new challenge, remembering details of his operations, keeping track of money, and ensuring his men remained loyal. Each mistake, each forgotten meeting, added to the tension in his empire. Capone knew that one slip could unravel everything he had built, and this knowledge gnawed at him constantly. The once mighty Scarface began to see cracks in every corner. Former allies, sensing his vulnerability, started whispering behind his back. Rumors of betrayal spread through the city, reaching ears he had long trusted. The paranoia that had once been a tool now became a cage, trapping him in a world where even familiar faces seemed suspicious. Capone's empire, built on fear and respect, now required more fear than he could muster. His health continued to decline rapidly. The disease gnawed at his brain, leaving gaps in memory and judgment. He would forget the names of loyal men, misplace important documents, and sometimes not recognize the very streets he had once ruled. Doctors warned that the illness was irreversible, but Capone, ever defiant, refused to show weakness. To the outside world, he maintained a mask of authority, but behind closed doors, he trembled with the knowledge that his empire was crumbling. Violence remained his weapon, but it no longer brought control, only temporary compliance. Men began questioning orders quietly, alliances shifted, and the loyalty he had once commanded freely was eroding. Even the speakeasies, which had been symbols of his dominance, were no longer safe havens. Capone's every move was now shadowed by uncertainty, and each decision carried the weight of possible ruin. In rare moments of clarity, Capone reflected on his rise and the countless lives destroyed along the way. The victories that once seemed glorious now appeared hollow. He understood that his fear-driven empire could not withstand the inevitable truth. Time, disease, and betrayal were forces beyond any gangster's control. And as the city moved on, no longer trembling at his name, Al Capone faced a sobering realization: he was no longer untouchable. By now, even his closest confidants noticed a change. The sharp mind that orchestrated killings and managed empires was fading. They saw him struggle with simple decisions, hear him ramble about imagined threats, and witness moments of unexplained rage. Scarface, the terror of Chicago, was becoming a cautionary tale, a man consumed by the very fears and secrets he had once wielded to rule the underworld. As Al Capone entered the final chapters of his life, the empire he had built with cunning, fear, and violence was quietly unraveling. The streets that once obeyed his every command no longer trembled at his name. Rival gangs had learned to avoid direct confrontation, law enforcement was relentless, and even the men he had trusted implicitly began to doubt his stability. Scarface, once the untouchable king of Chicago, was now a man haunted by shadows of his own making. Inside his mansion, Capone's paranoia intensified. He double-checked every transaction, scrutinized every visitor, and questioned every loyal lieutenant. Sleep brought no rest. Dreams were filled with images of betrayal, violence, and looming defeat. Simple tasks became monumental, and decisions that once seemed effortless now required immense mental effort. His illness had progressed to a point where even basic instructions could be forgotten, and yet he maintained a facade of control, insisting that no one see his weakness. The physical toll mirrored the mental decay. Tremors shook his hands, fatigue sapped his energy, and his once imposing stature diminished. Doctors warned that his condition was irreversible, but Capone refused to acknowledge it openly. The man who had once walked confidently through Chicago's streets like a king now moved cautiously, fearful of exposure and humiliation. Every glance, every whispered conversation, seemed to confirm that the world was closing in. Capone's relationships deteriorated rapidly. Allies who had survived decades of loyalty began drifting away. Some were captured by law enforcement, others abandoned the empire, sensing the decline. Fear alone could not hold the men together. Commands were questioned quietly, decisions were delayed, and subtle betrayals began to appear. The empire of fear that had sustained him for so long now threatened to collapse from within. He also faced the stark reality of his past actions. The bodies, betrayals, and crimes that had secured his power returned to him in fleeting moments of clarity. Guilt, remorse, and haunting memories weighed heavily on his mind. He could no longer hide behind money, violence, or intimidation. The very foundation of his power, the respect and fear of others, was eroding faster than he could reinforce it. By this point, Al Capone realized that his control was an illusion. The empire he had fought to maintain, the legend he had created, and the fear he had instilled were all fragile constructs, threatened not by rival gangsters or law enforcement alone, but by time, disease, and the collapse of his own mind. Scarface, the legendary gangster, was no longer invincible. He was a man battling an unstoppable tide, a man confronting the inevitable decline that no amount of power could prevent. In the final stage of Al Capone's life, the reality of his decline became unavoidable. His empire, once feared and untouchable, had fractured under the weight of law enforcement, internal betrayal, and the inexorable passage of time. Capone's health, deteriorating from neurosyphilis, robbed him of clarity, leaving him confused and vulnerable. No amount of wealth or past power could shield him from the consequences of his own actions. Isolated in his later years, Capone reflected on the choices that had defined his life. The violence, the manipulation, the control, each moment of dominance now appeared hollow. The men who had once obeyed without question had either left, turned against him, or succumbed to the pressures of law and life. The city he had ruled so ruthlessly no longer recognized his authority. It moved forward, indifferent to the legend that had once haunted its streets. Capone's mental decline accelerated, marked by erratic behavior, lapses in memory, and moments of profound frustration. Tasks that had once been second nature, reading reports, recalling names, making strategic decisions, became overwhelming. He struggled to maintain his image, aware that any display of weakness could be fatal in the world he had created. Fear, which had once been his ultimate weapon, now isolated him further, making him a prisoner of his own mind. Even in solitude, Capone could not escape the ghosts of his past. Faces of rivals, betrayed allies, and victims of his violence haunted him. Memories of murders ordered, deals manipulated, and trust broken returned relentlessly, reminding him that power comes at a cost. The man who had once ruled Chicago with absolute control now faced the harsh truth that time, illness, and conscience were forces beyond any gangster's reach. Ultimately, Al Capone's story concluded not with a grand defeat in the streets, but with the quiet collapse of mind and body. The empire he had built on fear, violence, and cunning disintegrated, leaving only the legend of Scarface, a cautionary tale of power, hubris, and the inevitable consequences of a life lived in shadows. What Al Capone tried to hide forever was laid bare by time. Even the most feared and powerful cannot escape the fragility of their own humanity. Al Capone's final days were a stark contrast to the image of power and fear he had cultivated for decades. Once the untouchable king of Chicago's underworld, he now faced a life stripped of authority, health, and confidence. The empire he had built on ruthless efficiency, strategic violence, and unyielding control was crumbling, not because of rivals or law enforcement alone, but because of the relentless deterioration of his own mind and body. Every day became a struggle to remember the simplest details, to navigate conversations, and to maintain the fragile illusion of control he had fought so hard to project. Isolation became Capone's constant companion. Former allies, once loyal and fearless, distanced themselves, sensing the vulnerability that had begun to define him. Trusted lieutenants hesitated to make decisions without guidance, and even the most obedient men grew wary. Fear, which had once been his most powerful weapon, now served only to remind him of what he had lost: the absolute obedience of those around him, the unchallenged authority that had made him Scarface, the king of Chicago. His health, ravaged by neurosyphilis, left him increasingly vulnerable. Tremors shook his hands, memory lapses disrupted his plans, and mental fog clouded every decision. Simple tasks became monumental challenges. Reading letters, recalling names, and keeping track of finances, all of these required immense effort and constant attention. The sharp, calculating mind that had once orchestrated an empire of fear was now diminished, leaving him reliant on memory and instincts that were no longer reliable. This deterioration created a new kind of terror, one that no amount of wealth or past violence could suppress: the terror of his own failing mind. Within the walls of his home, Capone wrestled with guilt, regret, and haunting memories. Faces of men he had betrayed, rivals he had eliminated, and innocents caught in the crossfire filled his dreams. In quiet moments, he reflected on the cost of his ambition, lives lost, friendships destroyed, and the loneliness that accompanied a life dominated by fear and control. The lessons he had ignored during his rise now became painfully clear. Power obtained through violence is fleeting, loyalty is conditional, and time eventually exposes every weakness. Even as the outside world moved on, Capone remained trapped in the ruins of his empire. The newspapers no longer feared him, the city no longer trembled at his name. Those who remembered his reign of terror spoke in past tense, as if Scarface were already a story rather than a living presence. Al Capone's legacy was preserved in legend, but the man himself existed in the shadows of memory, confined by illness, paranoia, and the inevitability of mortality. Ultimately, Al Capone's life ended not with a dramatic confrontation or a final act of defiance, but with quiet deterioration and reflection. The empire he had once commanded, the fear he had instilled, and the reputation that had made him immortal in criminal history all succumbed to time, disease, and the fragility of human existence. Scarface, the man who had terrorized Chicago, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that no amount of power, violence, or cunning can protect a human being from the consequences of their own choices, nor from the unstoppable forces of mortality and decay. His secrets, once buried under layers of wealth and intimidation, were laid bare by the unyielding truth of life, proving that even the most feared gangster is ultimately vulnerable to the inexorable passage of time and the collapse of mind, body, and empire.